My family always puts family first, and it started with my great-grandfather, who told my grandfather, older siblings, to always watch over their little brothers and sisters. And so my grandfather told my dad to always watch over his little sister, and my dad has told my two older brothers to watch over me and my sister, and for me to watch over my little sister.
This is a story about how my dad's parents came to America from Canada. They were married in 1950 and they moved to America in 1955. They moved to Meriden, Connecticut with one of my dad's father's sisters who already had lived here for years. And my dad's mom was 26, my dad's dad was 27 when they moved, and when they came to America, my dad's dad worked repairing houses with a Frenchman who lived here, and my dad's mom worked as a tailor in downtown Meriden.
So my story is about my great-grandmother. She's an immigrant from Poland. At the age of 6 or 7 years old, she was around in World War II, and her father was taken from a concentration camp, and so were some other people in the village, and they were never seen again. So because of the war, she couldn't go to school, and she had to work on her farm. They were always afraid of the Germans, and they would have to hide in the bushes. Well, they didn't have to, but they did. And her grandfather always told her to be quiet and stay low from the Germans. The Germans took all the milk from their cows, so they had no milk, but they left all their animals, and so eventually her family went hungry and they ran out of food, and she aged and she eventually moved to America with my great-grandfather, and that's the story of her.
This is a story about my grandpa moving to Connecticut from Hungary. My grandpa, he lived in Pilishanto, Hungary, and in 1956, when the Revolutionary War was taking place in Hungary, he didn't want to fight, so he left, and he went to Nova Scotia, and then ended up in New Jersey. Then he came up to Manchester, Connecticut, to live with one of his friends, and he taught himself to speak and read English. And he met my grandma through mutual friends when he was still living in Bridgeport, and then they got married in 1959.
My great uncle and my grandfather both enlisted in the Marines during the time of Vietnam. They didn't know it, but my grandfather was actually going to be my uncle's future father-in-law. They met at a firefight. I don't know exactly where, but at some place in Vietnam. They met each other because their platoons both crossed. And years later, after the war, my great uncle was now my great aunt, and he saw that my grandfather was his father-in-law.
My great-great-great-grandfather always promoted to have peace between even if you're enemies. And one day my great-great-great-grandfather served in the Ottoman Empire's military as a general, and one day he got shot when he was trying to run through the woods, and a French soldier found him and brought him to their base secretly and fed him and healed his wounds, and when he woke up, gave him some food and sent him back to his base. And my great-great-grandfather promised him to always remember him through his generations, and that's why it is a story in our family.
I'd like to tell the story of my grandma, who lived in Germany. When my grandma was born, it was about the start of World War II. As a little kid, she grew up in half a house because of all the Nazis were bombing all the towns. One time, she was riding her bike on the street, and she heard sirens that went off indicating that Nazi planes were about to attack. My great-grandma ran and shoved her into a ditch so she didn't get shot to death. After the war, my great-grandma met an American soldier who soon fell in love with him, and then they both went to America to live and my, so.
This is a story about how my great grandpa came to America. It was in like when World War II was coming on, when the Japanese invaded China. That's how they came.
This is a story about, I was told by my mom, and it's a story about my great-grandfather in World War I. During the end of World War I, my great-grandfather was drafted, even though he had 6 children at home. And when he was on camp, one of his friends or neighbors from his hometown came up to him and told him that his wife and 2 of his children had the Spanish flu. It was called influenza. And he walked right from the camp. He walked to his hometown to go be with his wife and his 2 children. His 2 children passed away, but my great-grandmother was still alive.
All right, this is a story about my great-grandma. During the Great Depression, my great-grandma lived in Ireland. She was married to a drunk who beat her. She had 1 kid with him. Back then, divorce wasn't really heard of, but she divorced him, and she was left at the age of 24 with my grandma alone to care for her. She worked at a sewing shop and made little money. Some days she's had to eat bacon grease, and that's it. Once the Depression was over, my great-grandma and grandma moved to America, and my grandmother started a family. That's how my family got to America.
This is a story about how my grandma, my grandpa, and their 10 kids moved to America. They first moved to Maine, and then they moved to Meriden, Connecticut. And then my grandma and my grandpa didn't know how to speak English, and they had to translate to their kids. No, that was it. Okay.
Justice to my height here. Alright, my story is about my grandfather and him in the Vietnam War. He enlisted when he was 16, and he was like the new kid around town, so all the soldiers that were with him in the Marines tried to they had to teach him how to use all the equipment and stuff, but they picked on him. So he was trying to use this really big cannon that they shot off of the ship, and he was standing right next to it, but no one told him it was like the loudest cannon that they had. So they fired it, and from then he went almost completely deaf in both of his ears. So now he's in his 70s, and he can only hear with really high-powered hearing aids. So he always tells me the lesson is always be prepared, and if someone picks on you, pick on him back.
My story is about my great-grandfather in World War I. He faked his age to get into the Army. He was 14, he had to be 16. He joined the Canadian Black Watch, and they didn't know how old he was until he was actually in combat. And he got thanks from the King of England for his services in the military.
My story is about my great-grandfather hiding a Jewish family during World War II. During World War II, my great-grandfather was in Greece, and the Germans were occupying his town, and he was trying to hide a Jewish family in the basement, but he also had 2 Germans staying upstairs. And then the Germans, Jewish family, they ended up moving them to a doctor's house because the Germans started using their house as a headquarters. And once the Germans stopped occupying the town, they became like family friends.
This is a story about my great-great-great-grandfather. He was an emperor in Italy, and he has a really big castle. And my grandma went to Italy a couple years ago to visit the Malatesta Castle.
My story is about my grandpa. He owns a maple syrup farm in Canada, And one night, my great grandpa, like the sap, the sap. There was too much sap in the buckets, so they had to spend like all night like boiling water and making a bunch of maple syrup, and like they had to like work hard. Yeah.
Oh, this is the story of how my grandpa doesn't like tornadoes. During one of the family vacations out in Iowa, they were renting a log cabin, and in the middle of the vacation, 5 tornadoes touched down in the same day. And when he went outside after it, he found that a tree had fallen down. There were sticks about half a foot thick, like spears in the ground, and of all the destruction, it still left the plastic forks on the picnic table.